Hi everyone, I just saw Jaws, the 50th anniversary re-release of the film, and what really stood out to me was that this was a great movie that was a missed opportunity in the history of cinema. Now, how can you say that about one of the most influential films ever made? Well, here's what stood out to me. Seeing it on the big screen, obviously you realise it is a beautiful art film. It is stunningly unified, like the way the blues and the reds, the water and the blood are echoed all the way through the film, whether it's the red or orange dress that the central character's wife is wearing in the first scene as she stands against the ocean wishing him goodbye, whether it's the red sirens next to the blue of the sea, all through the film with slight kind of excursions into orange and green as well, which I guess are sister colours. We see a very unified palette, which I think is brilliantly done. The pacing is incredible. The music is, of course, very, very famous, and I'll say more about that later. This is a highly artistic work with a very self-conscious, highly raw palette. But it's not just that. It's also very much a film about what you don't see. We know this because we know that we don't see the shark very often, and it's very famous that Spielberg had technical problems showing the shark. He wanted to show it a lot more. Well, let me, pretentious moment, quote William Morris, the great art critic of the 19th century: "You can't get art without resistance in the materials." This film resisted Spielberg. He hated it, making it so much that he ran away after the final, even before the last frame on the beach was shot, because he wanted to escape his crew who were going to throw him into the sea. This was a very difficult shoot. The central character and his wife did not get on very well, and in general it was fraught. But the truth is, it's that resistance, it's that inability of Spielberg to make the film he wanted that makes it so brilliant, because we don't see the shark very often. We see trackers of the shark, most famously where the shark is swims out and then turns, and it's got the rope attached to a broken jetty in its mouth, and what we see is the broken bit of wood pursuing the guy who's swimming away. So, in other words, it's a film about what's underneath the surface, what you can't quite make out. And when you do see the shark, it does actually work very well, but it works well because the shark is also, to some extent, reduced to fragments. Jaws. The jaws of the shark are really the shark. The rest of it, although it's important that it's big and so on, the rest of it is much less important. We have a fin and we have the jaws. Now, why does that matter? Well, because there are two films which immediately spring to mind when you see it on the big screen. One is really obvious, which is the film that Spielberg would go on to make later, Jurassic Park. And one came to me as I watched, I'm sure lots of other people have mentioned this, and that is The Birds by Hitchcock, which it's incredible to think was only 12 years earlier. It feels like 50 years have elapsed between these two films, both in terms of the cinematography and in terms of the characterization. But in fact, it's only 12 years. And there's a moment, there are obvious parallels between all of these films. If you think about it, Jurassic Park is the development of Jaws, and The Birds is the foreshadowing of Jaws. And what is Jaws doing with that legacy, and what is it giving forward to the future that either gets picked up by Spielberg or doesn't? That's kind of what I was thinking about as I watched. And what I really noticed is that there's one moment which refers directly back to The Birds, which is Hooper, who's the marine biologist character, swims underneath one of the boats in the that's floating out in the ocean that's been attacked by the shark, and a one-eyed corpse kind of looms up out of the water. It's a jump scare moment that got me, even now in the cinema, knowing it was coming. And of course, it's the same moment as in The Birds when Tippi Hedren's character walks around a corner and looks down a corridor, and we get the camera moving in silently in 3 flashes on this man who's had his eyes pecked out by the birds. It's the same moment where we shift into looking straight at horror, and we realise that there are no limits to what this natural mutant will do. In both cases, it's as though we're rediscovering a familiar animal. Like, we know what the birds do, we know what sharks do, but no, the familiar has become alien and is now attacking us. This shark doesn't behave like any other shark ever behaves. In fact, it's a shape-shifting monster, but so are the birds. But there are two big differences between the way monstrous nature is used in the birds and the way it's used in Jaws. And in both cases, I think Jaws emerges as superior, although I think the birds is one of the great masterpieces of cinema. And that is, number one, that Hitchcock went super literal with the birds. He really wanted people to notice how effectively he'd animated the birds, to the point where he threw them, famously, notoriously, dead corpses of birds at Tippi Hedren's face when she was filming the scene in the attic where her character gets injured. We are actually watching someone being traumatized in that scene. It's a shocking scene in retrospect, and part of Hitchcock's broader problem with his female protagonists and actresses. But also, it's part of the film's aesthetic, which is that it matters that the birds are really there. It matters that we see them. If we didn't see them, the whole thing would become a comedy. For a parallel example of a comedy like that, think about that M. Night Shyamalan film, I actually now forget which one it is, where it's about seeds being blown from trees and causing people to die. There's a great moment in that film where one of the characters has to run away from a bunch of trees in terror, and it's just comic because it's like, honey, they're trees. But when you actually put the birds in, it becomes genuinely frightening. You need them. The great shot where the camera pans away and then pans back and you're looking at all the birds assembling on the climbing frame, we physically need them. Jaws submerges its monster and presents it in fragments and pieces and doesn't do big reveals until later on, and even then only does partial ones. And that seems of a piece with its less expressionist aesthetic. So I would say that Hitchcock is really into everything turned outward, almost theatrically. Everything is explicit in the birds. Even Tippi Hedren's face, when she's standing in that phone box and she's looking at the birds as they come down on the town, looks like a Greek tragic mask. You know, she's kind of, everything's very theatrical. In this film, only 12 years later, cinema has grown to the point where things are fluid and intimate and conversational. One of my favourite scenes in this film is where Hooper, Brady, is that his name? The sheriff, the chief of police, and his wife are all sitting down to dinner, and there's this flirtatious vibe between the wife and Hooper, which I believe was borrowed from the source text, Peter Benchley's Jaws, where she actually has an affair with the character. But there's a kind of series of awkward jokes about how they're all managing the situation. And it's easy and fluent and quite sort of middle-aged. It's like people who are used to playing with who they are and have handled erotic dynamics before. The husband's not troubled by the milder vibe between his wife and this man. This slightly younger man has brought 2 bottles of wine because he's kind of awkward about which one they need. And the whole thing is beautifully played, just as a scene of human beings having relationships. And suddenly you're aware, in a way the birds makes you aware differently, of the extraordinary fragility of our little emotional world on our island. There's that great moment when the police chief says to Hooper, the marine biologist, it's only an island if you look at it from the sea. He's trying to defend living on an island as an aquaphobe. And Hooper's like, yeah, that makes sense. But it kind of does make sense. We live inside our closed little communities trying to forget about the massive expanse of threat and the unknown that surrounds us, even our planet moving through the universe, but also our little lives, rounded, as Shakespeare says in The Tempest, with a death. So you know, in a way, this film handles threat and mortality and the monstrous more subtly than the birds. And what really interests me is when you go on towards Jurassic Park, it's a wonderful film. It's got to be one of the great films Spielberg ever made. But I think we took the wrong lesson from it. We took the lesson from it as a culture that what mattered was the spectacle, that what mattered was the dinosaurs and how brilliantly they were manifested on screen. And even in that brilliant film, you can see characters slightly receding into stereotype. Richard Attenborough gives a great performance, but it's not as rich a character as it might be. It's as though what we're looking at is Spielberg reflecting on the fact that, as Attenborough says, the first thing he had was a flea market when he was a child. A flea circus. In other words, a circus where there are no actual fleas, where people imagine it instead of see it. And now he's built this theme park and it's all real. Well, that is a self-portrait from Spielberg in certain ways. This is a reflection on the fact that he's become complicit with the cinema of spectacle that film partly critiques by showing how dangerous it is. And it's so ironic that film gave rise to a genre of monster movie and of horror movie which has taken the prompt, put everything out there, right out front. Don't go for intimacy, go for drama. So The Birds won, and by the way, I think The Birds is too magnificent to be criticised for this, but The Birds won. That form of horror movie making won. And yet the films that are being made now lack, I think, mostly The Bird's incredible tragic tension and the way in which it almost feels like it's Euripides staged for the modern age. Jaws is one of the great, influential, famous summer blockbusters, but we took the wrong lesson from it, and so did its very director, and that's its tragedy.